William Thompson stood at his kitchen window, watching the morning rain streak down the glass like tears he couldn't shed. His coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but he hadn't noticed. These days, he barely noticed anything at all. The silence in his house had become so thick he could almost touch it, wrapping around him like a heavy blanket that made everything feel distant and muffled. Catherine used to fill this silence. Her laughter would bounce off these same walls, her voice calling his name from upstairs, her humming while she made breakfast. Now the house held nothing but empty spaces where her presence used to be. William had always been a quiet man, but Catherine's silence was different. It was the kind of quiet that screamed louder than any argument they'd ever had. 3 months ago, everything had been normal. Catherine would wake up before him, her red hair spread across the pillow like autumn leaves. She'd make that little satisfied sound when she stretched, then slip out of bed to start the coffee. William would pretend to be asleep, stealing moments to watch her move around their bedroom, collecting clothes for the day. She had this way of humming under her breath, melodies he never recognized but somehow knew by heart. But somewhere between then and now, Catherine had started disappearing piece by piece. It wasn't sudden, like in the movies where someone storms out after a big fight. It was gradual, like watching a photograph fade in sunlight. First the humming stopped, then the conversations at dinner became shorter, more polite. She started going to bed earlier, claiming she was tired from work. The morning kisses became quick pecks, then eventually nothing at all. William tried to pinpoint when it started, but the changes had been so small he'd missed them until they added up to something enormous. Maybe it was when he'd forgotten their anniversary dinner, too caught up in a work deadline to remember. Maybe it was the promotion he'd taken without discussing it with her first, the one that meant longer hours and weekend calls. Maybe it was simply that they'd grown into different people without noticing. Like two trees planted close together that slowly bend away from each other, toward different patches of sunlight. He'd always thought love was enough. Love would fix things, love would bring her back, love would make everything right again. But love, he was learning, needed more than just existing. It needed attention like a garden. It needed words and time and presence, things he'd forgotten how to give somewhere along the way. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd become successful at everything except the thing that mattered most. His construction company was thriving. He'd built houses for half the town, created homes where other families lived and laughed and fought and made up. But he couldn't seem to build a bridge back to his own wife. Catherine worked at the local library, a job she'd taken part-time when they'd first married, but had grown to love. She'd tell him stories about the regular visitors, the elderly man who came in every Tuesday to read newspapers from his hometown in Ireland, the young mother who brought her twins for story time, the teenager who was working his way through every science fiction novel in the building. William used to love these stories. The way Catherine's face lit up when she talked about her work, how she remembered everyone's names and preferences. But lately, when he asked about her day, she'd just say it was fine. Fine was Catherine's new favorite word. How was work? Fine. How was lunch with your sister? Fine. How are you feeling? Fine. Each fine felt like a door closing, another piece of her moving further away from him. Yesterday, he'd found her wedding ring on the bathroom counter, not thrown down in anger, not left there as a statement, just placed carefully next to her toothbrush, like she'd taken it off to wash her hands and forgotten to put it back on. But William knew Catherine never forgot anything. She remembered birthdays of co-workers' children, the anniversary date of when their neighbor's husband passed away, the exact day they'd planted each flower in their garden. He'd picked up the ring, feeling the weight of it in his palm. It was the same ring he'd saved for 6 months to buy, working overtime at the construction site, eating packed lunches instead of going out with the crew. He'd been so proud when he'd finally been able to afford it. Proud that he could give Catherine something beautiful, something that showed her how much she meant to him. Now it sat in his pocket, a small circle of gold that felt heavier than any beam he'd ever lifted. He kept touching it throughout the day, rolling it between his fingers, wondering if she'd noticed it was gone, wondering if she cared. The house felt bigger when Catherine wasn't speaking to him. Every room echoed with conversations they weren't having, with explanations that weren't being given, with apologies that weren't being made. William found himself talking to their cat Maisie just to hear a voice in the house. Maisie would look at him with those knowing green eyes, as if she understood that something important was breaking apart and there wasn't much time left to fix it. But fixing required knowing what was broken, and Catherine wouldn't tell him. She'd just smile, that polite smile she gave to strangers at the grocery store, and say everything was fine. That word again, building walls between them, one syllable at a time. William finished his cold coffee and set the mug in the sink next to Catherine's breakfast dishes. She'd eaten toast and had orange juice, the same breakfast she'd had every morning for the past month. Before that, she used to vary it up, sometimes making eggs, sometimes having cereal, sometimes surprising him with pancakes on weekend mornings. Now everything about Catherine had become predictable, careful, controlled. He wondered if this was how marriages ended. Not with screaming or accusations, but with politeness and silence and breakfast dishes left in the sink, with rings placed carefully on bathroom counters and conversations that never went deeper than comments about the weather. The rain outside was getting heavier, and William realized he'd been standing at the window for over an hour. Catherine would be home from work soon, and they'd have another evening of careful conversation and early bedtimes. Another night of sleeping in the same bed while feeling miles apart. He didn't know it yet, but tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, Catherine would finally break her silence, and everything he thought he understood about their marriage would change forever. The next evening arrived with the kind of stillness that made William's skin crawl. Catherine had come home from the library at her usual time, 5:30 sharp, her canvas bag slung over her shoulder filled with books she'd borrowed for the weekend. She'd smiled at him when she walked through the door, that same careful smile that never quite reached her eyes anymore, and asked about his day. William had told her about the new house foundation they'd poured, about how the weather had held up just long enough to get the concrete set properly. She'd nodded in all the right places, made appropriate comments about how hard he worked, how good he was at his job. But there was something different in her posture tonight, something that made him pay closer attention to the way she held herself, like she was carrying something heavy that he couldn't see. They'd eaten dinner together at the kitchen table, the same table where they'd shared thousands of meals over their 8 years of marriage. Catherine had made spaghetti with the meat sauce she knew he liked, had even remembered to add extra garlic the way his mother used to make it. But she'd barely touched her own plate, moving the pasta around with her fork while asking him about his day, about his work, about everything except what was really happening between them. After dinner, Catherine did something she hadn't done in months. Instead of immediately clearing the table and washing dishes, she sat back in her chair and looked at him directly. Really looked at him like she was trying to memorize his face. Her green eyes, which had been so distant lately, suddenly seemed very present, very sad. "William," she said, and her voice was softer than it had been in weeks. "We need to talk." Those 4 words hit him like a cold wave. He'd been waiting for this conversation for months, dreading it and hoping for it at the same time. Part of him wanted to fix whatever was wrong, but another part was terrified of what she might say, what truths might come out that couldn't be taken back. "Okay," he said, though his throat felt tight. "What about?" Catherine looked down at her hands, which were folded carefully in her lap. She wasn't wearing her wedding ring, and the pale band of skin where it used to sit seemed to glow in the kitchen light. When she looked up again, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I've been trying to find the right words for months," she began. "I've practiced this conversation in my head so many times, but it never gets easier." She took a shaky breath. "William, I love you. I need you to know that first, because what I'm about to say might make you think I don't. But I do love you. I always have." William felt his heart start to race. Love followed by "but" was never good news. He wanted to reach across the table and take her hands, but something in her posture told him to wait, to let her finish. "But I feel like I'm disappearing," Catherine continued. "Like every day I become a little less myself, and I don't know how to stop it. When I wake up in the morning, I have to remind myself who I am, what I like, what I want. And the terrible thing is, I'm not sure I remember anymore." She paused, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. William had seen Catherine cry before, but this was different. These weren't tears of frustration or sadness about something external. These were tears that came from somewhere deep inside, from a place that had been hurting for a long time. "I know you love me too," she said, "but I think we love the people we used to be, not who we are now. You love the Catherine who used to laugh at your jokes and make big Sunday breakfasts and plan elaborate birthday parties. And I love the William who used to ask me about my dreams and stay up late talking about what we wanted our life to look like. William opened his mouth to protest, to say that he still loved her exactly as she was, but Catherine held up a gentle hand. "Let me finish, please. I need to get this out." Her voice was stronger now, more certain. Somewhere along the way, we stopped being curious about each other. We stopped asking the important questions. We became roommates who shared a bed and a mortgage, but we stopped being partners who shared dreams and fears and hopes. The truth of her words hit William like a physical blow. When was the last time he'd asked Catherine what she was reading, what she was thinking about, what made her happy? When was the last time he'd told her about something that excited him, something that scared him, something he'd been wondering about? I started staying late at the library because it was the only place I felt like myself anymore, Catherine admitted. Mrs. Henderson, who comes in every Thursday, asks me about my weekend plans. Tom, the teenager who loves science fiction, tells me about his dreams of becoming a writer. The book club ladies invite me to their discussions because they value my opinions. At home, I felt like I was just there, taking up space, going through motions. William realized with horrifying clarity that he couldn't remember the last time he'd asked Catherine for her opinion on anything important. He made decisions about their finances, their social plans, their future without really consulting her. He'd assumed that silence meant agreement, that lack of complaint meant contentment. "I know you work hard," Catherine said. "I know you're building something important with your business, and I'm proud of you. But somewhere in building that life, we forgot to build our relationship. We forgot to tend to us." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small notebook, placing it on the table between them. William recognized it as the journal she'd always carried. The one where she used to write down book recommendations from library patrons, grocery lists, random thoughts. "I've been writing down things I remember about us," she said. "Good things. The way you used to leave little notes in my lunch. How you'd call me on your break just to hear my voice. The Saturday mornings when we'd read the paper together and plan our garden. The dreams we had about traveling to Ireland, about maybe having kids someday, about growing old together on the front porch of this house." William's chest felt tight. He remembered all of those things, but they felt like memories from someone else's life. Someone who had more time. Someone who hadn't gotten so caught up in the business of living that he'd forgotten to actually live. "I miss that version of us," Catherine whispered. "I miss feeling like your partner instead of your cohabitant. I miss being excited about our future instead of just getting through each day." The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence that followed. William stared at the notebook, wondering what other memories Catherine had written down, what other pieces of their relationship she'd been trying to preserve on paper while the real thing slowly died. "What are you saying?" he asked, though he was afraid he already knew. Catherine's tears started falling harder now, but her voice remained steady. "I'm saying that I can't keep living like this. I can't keep pretending that fine is good enough, that existing in the same space is the same as building a life together. I can't keep losing pieces of myself and calling it love." She closed the notebook and held it against her chest like it contained something precious. "I'm saying that I need time to remember who I am when I'm not trying so hard to be who I think you want me to be. And I think you need time to figure out if you actually want a partner or just someone to share expenses with." William felt the ground shifting beneath him, felt everything he'd thought was solid starting to crumble. "Catherine, please. We can fix this. We can go to counseling, we can take a trip, we can—" "William." Her voice was gentle but firm. "This isn't something that can be fixed with a vacation or a few therapy sessions. This is about who we've become as people, and whether those people can build something real together or if we're just going through the motions because it's easier than admitting we've grown apart." The weight of her words settled over them like dust after an explosion. William understood now that this conversation wasn't the beginning of fixing their problems. It was Catherine finally saying out loud what they'd both been feeling for months, but had been too afraid to acknowledge. Their marriage wasn't just struggling. It might already be over. William sat frozen in his chair, staring at Catherine as her words echoed in the sudden silence between them. The kitchen felt smaller somehow, like the walls were closing in around this conversation that was changing everything. He could hear the refrigerator humming, the clock on the wall ticking, his own heartbeat loud in his ears. Everything sounded amplified, as if his senses were trying to compensate for the fact that his world was falling apart. "How long have you been planning this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question came out before he could stop it, and he immediately regretted it. It sounded accusatory, like he thought she'd been plotting against him, when really he was just trying to understand how they'd gotten to this point without him noticing. Catherine looked down at her hands again, and William could see her fingers trembling slightly. "I haven't been planning anything," she said softly. "I've been hoping. For months I've been hoping that we'd find our way back to each other, that you'd notice I was struggling, that we'd have a conversation like this before it got so bad." The honesty in her voice cut through him. She'd been waiting for him to notice, to care enough to ask the hard questions, to fight for them. Instead, he'd been content to let the silence grow, to accept her polite smiles and quiet responses as proof that everything was fine. "I notice now," he said, leaning forward across the table. "Catherine, I notice now. Tell me what you need. Tell me how to fix this." She looked up at him then, and the sadness in her eyes was so deep it took his breath away. "That's just it, William. I can't tell you how to love me. I can't give you a list of things to do to make our marriage work. Love isn't a construction project where you follow a blueprint and end up with exactly what you planned." William felt a flash of frustration, the same feeling he got when clients couldn't explain what they wanted from him, when they expected him to read their minds and deliver something perfect without clear direction. But this wasn't a job. This was his wife, his life, his marriage falling apart in front of him. "Then what am I supposed to do?" he asked. "You're telling me everything that's wrong, but you won't tell me how to make it right." "How is that fair?" Catherine's expression shifted, and for a moment he saw a flash of the woman he'd fallen in love with, the one who never backed down from difficult conversations, who challenged him to be better even when it was uncomfortable. "Fair?" she repeated. "William, I've been trying to tell you what's wrong for months. Every time I suggested we spend a weekend together without your phone, every time I asked if we could have dinner without the TV on, every time I tried to start a real conversation about our future, our dreams, our problems, you said you were too busy, too tired, that we'd talk later. When was later supposed to come?" The truth of her words hit him like a slap. He remembered those moments now, conversations that had felt like interruptions at the time, requests that had seemed unreasonable when he had deadlines to meet and contracts to review. He'd pushed them off, promising himself they'd have time to talk when things calmed down at work. But things never calmed down. There was always another project, another deadline, another reason to postpone the conversations that mattered most. "I thought I was working hard for us," he said weakly. "I thought I was building a good life for us." "You were building a life around me, not with me," Catherine replied. "There's a difference. You made all the decisions about what our life should look like, and I went along with it because I didn't want to seem ungrateful. But I never felt like a partner in creating that life. I felt like a tenant in a house someone else designed." William thought about their house, the one he'd built himself 3 years after they'd married. He'd been so proud of it, so sure Catherine would love it. He'd chosen the lot, designed the layout, picked the finishes. He'd asked her opinion on things like paint colors and cabinet hardware, but never on the big decisions. Never on whether she actually wanted to live in a custom house on the edge of town, away from her friends in the downtown area she loved. Never on whether the open floor plan he'd thought was modern and impressive actually made her feel exposed and uncomfortable. "You never said you didn't like the house," he said, grasping for something concrete to hold on to. "I never said I didn't like a lot of things," Catherine replied, "because saying I didn't like them felt like saying I didn't appreciate all your hard work. I felt ungrateful for wanting different things than what you were giving me. So I stopped wanting different things. I stopped wanting anything at all." The defeat in her voice was worse than anger would have been. Anger meant there was still fight left, still passion worth saving. This quiet resignation meant she'd already begun the process of letting go. "What about counseling?" William asked desperately. "People go to counseling all the time. They work things out." Catherine nodded slowly. "I called Dr. Martinez 3 weeks ago. She has an opening next Thursday at 4:30. I was going to ask if you'd come with me." William felt a surge of hope. "Yes, absolutely, we'll go together. We'll figure this out." But Catherine's expression didn't match his optimism. "William, I need you to understand something. I'm not asking you to go to counseling to save our marriage. I'm asking you to go to counseling to help us figure out how to end it in a way that doesn't destroy us both." The words hit him like a physical blow. He'd been thinking of counseling as a repair service, something that would fix what was broken and get them back on track. But Catherine was talking about it like end-of-life care, something to make the dying process easier. "You've already decided," he said, and it wasn't a question. Catherine's eyes filled with tears again. "I've decided that I can't keep living like this. I've decided that I deserve to be in a relationship where I feel seen and heard and valued. I've decided that you deserve to be with someone who doesn't make you feel like you're constantly failing at something you don't understand." She stood up from the table, picking up her notebook and holding it against her chest like armor. "I've decided that staying together because we're scared to be alone isn't a good enough reason anymore. And I've decided that loving someone sometimes means letting them go before you both forget why you fell in love in the first place." William watched her move around the kitchen, putting away the dishes from dinner, wiping down the counters with the same methodical care she brought to everything. These ordinary actions felt surreal, like watching someone pack for a trip while discussing the weather. "Where will you go?" he asked, though the question felt strange in his mouth. This was their house, their life. The idea of Catherine existing somewhere else seemed impossible. "My sister offered me her guest room," Catherine said without looking at him. "Just temporarily until I figure things out. I've been thinking about getting my own place, maybe closer to downtown. Somewhere I can walk to work, maybe join that book club at the community center." She'd already thought it through. While he'd been assuming their life would continue on its current trajectory, Catherine had been planning an exit strategy. The realization that she'd been living one life while secretly preparing for another felt like a betrayal, even though he understood it was really just survival. "When?" he asked. Catherine turned to face him, and he could see the effort it took for her to meet his eyes. "This weekend. I've already packed some things. They're in the spare room closet this weekend." Tomorrow was Friday, which meant he had less than 2 days before Catherine would leave their house, their life, their marriage. 2 days to process the end of everything he'd thought was permanent. "Catherine," he said, standing up and taking a step toward her. She didn't move away, but she didn't move closer either. "I love you. I know I haven't been good at showing it lately, but I do love you." "I know you do," she said softly. "And I love you too. But love isn't enough if we don't know how to take care of it. Love isn't enough if we've forgotten how to be curious about each other, how to grow together instead of apart." She walked over to him then, reaching up to touch his face with her palm. Her hand was warm and familiar, and William closed his eyes, trying to memorize the feeling. "Maybe this isn't the end," she whispered. "Maybe this is just us finally admitting that we need to learn how to love each other again. Maybe we need to remember who we are as individuals before we can figure out who we are together." When William opened his eyes, Catherine was looking at him with more tenderness than he'd seen from her in months. But underneath the tenderness was something final, something that told him that tomorrow would bring changes neither of them could undo. Friday morning came too quickly and not quickly enough. William had barely slept, spending most of the night staring at the ceiling while Catherine lay beside him. So still he wasn't sure she was sleeping either. The space between them and their king-sized bed felt like an ocean, though they were only inches apart. Every small sound seemed amplified in the darkness. The whisper of sheets when one of them shifted, the soft sigh Catherine made when she finally drifted off around 3 in the morning, the distant hum of early morning traffic starting up outside. When the alarm went off at 6:30, William realized he'd been dreading this moment since their conversation ended the night before. Friday meant one day closer to Catherine leaving. Friday meant facing his crew at work while his personal life crumbled. Friday meant pretending everything was normal, when nothing would ever be normal again. Catherine was already up, standing at the bathroom mirror in her blue terry cloth robe, the one he'd bought her for Christmas 3 years ago. She was brushing her teeth with the same methodical strokes she'd used every morning for 8 years, but there was something different about her posture, something looser, like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "Good morning," she said when she saw him in the mirror, and her voice was softer than it had been in months. Not warm exactly, but not cold either, just present, like she was actually seeing him instead of looking through him. "Morning," William replied, though his throat felt scratchy from a night of not speaking. "Did you sleep?" "A little," she said, rinsing her toothbrush. "Better than I have in weeks, actually." That stung more than he expected. The night that had felt like torture to him had given Catherine the first peaceful sleep she'd had in weeks. It was another reminder of how differently they'd been experiencing their marriage, how her silence hadn't meant contentment but exhaustion from pretending everything was fine. They moved around each other in the bathroom, with the choreography of 8 years of shared mornings, but everything felt different now. Catherine handed him his coffee mug without being asked, the way she always had, but this time it felt like a gesture of courtesy rather than intimacy. William found himself watching her more closely than usual, trying to memorize the way she moved, the little unconscious things she did that he'd stopped noticing somewhere along the way. At breakfast, Catherine broke the careful silence they'd been maintaining since waking up. "I called in sick to work today," she said, stirring honey into her tea. "I need to finish packing, and I want to take some time to think about what to say at counseling next week." William looked up from his eggs, surprised. Catherine never called in sick unless she was actually ill. She took pride in her reliability, in being someone her coworkers could count on. "You don't have to leave this weekend," he said quickly. "We could take more time to talk, to figure things out. Maybe if we just—" "William." Catherine's voice was gentle but firm. "We've had 8 years to figure things out. More time isn't going to change the fundamental problems we have. More time is just going to make this harder for both of us." She was right, and he knew it, but that didn't make it easier to accept. Part of him wanted to argue, to convince her to stay, to promise he could change overnight into the husband she needed. But a bigger part of him, the part that had been paying attention during their conversation last night, understood that this wasn't about quick fixes or promises. This was about two people who had grown in different directions and needed space to figure out if they could find their way back to each other. "What should I tell people?" he asked. "The crew, my clients, your family?" Catherine considered this for a moment. "The truth, I think. That we're taking some time apart to work on ourselves and our relationship. That we're going to counseling. That we don't know what's going to happen, but we're trying to handle it with respect for each other." William nodded, though he couldn't imagine actually saying those words out loud to his crew. He'd built his reputation on being the guy who had everything together, who could handle any project, solve any problem. Admitting that he couldn't fix his own marriage felt like admitting failure at the most basic level. After breakfast, William left for work while Catherine began the process of packing her life into boxes and suitcases. He'd offered to stay home and help, but she'd told him it would be easier if she did it alone. Another small rejection that felt enormous in the context of everything else that was happening. At the job site, William threw himself into work with an intensity that surprised his crew. He checked and double-checked measurements that didn't need checking, reorganized tool stations that were already organized, found problems that needed solving where none existed. His foreman, Danny, who'd worked with him for 5 years, finally pulled him aside around lunchtime. "Boss, what's going on with you today?" Danny asked, setting down his hard hat and looking at William with concern. "You're acting like the building inspector is coming and you haven't slept in a week." William stopped pretending, to study the blueprints he'd already memorized and looked at. Danny. They'd worked together long enough that Danny could read his moods better than most people. There was no point in pretending everything was fine. "Catherine and I are separating," William said, the words feeling strange and heavy in his mouth. "She's moving out this weekend." Danny's expression shifted from concern to surprise to sympathy in the space of a few seconds. "Jesus, William. I'm sorry. I had no idea you guys were having problems." "Neither did I, apparently," William said with a bitter laugh. "Turns out I missed a lot of signs." Danny was quiet for a moment, looking out at the half-built house they were working on. "You want to talk about it?" William shook his head. "Not really. I just need to work. I need to focus on something I actually know how to do right." Danny nodded, understanding. "We'll get this foundation finished today. Tomorrow we start framing. Gives you something to keep your hands busy while your head works through everything else." That afternoon, William worked harder than he had in months, losing himself in the physical demands of construction, the satisfaction of building something solid and real. But even as he focused on measurements and angles and the weight of materials, part of his mind kept drifting back to Catherine at home, packing 8 years of shared life into boxes. He thought about the things she might be deciding to take, the things she might leave behind. Her books, definitely. She had hundreds of them, everything from classic literature to contemporary fiction to gardening guides. Her grandmother's quilt that she kept folded at the foot of their bed, the coffee mug collection she'd started in college, each one a memento from a place she'd visited or a gift from someone she cared about. What did you take when you were dismantling a life? How did you decide which shared memories belonged to whom? The wedding photos, the furniture they'd picked out together, the Christmas ornaments they'd collected over the years. Who got to keep the physical evidence of their relationship? When William got home that evening, the house felt different immediately. It wasn't just that some of Catherine's things were missing, though he noticed the empty spaces on the bookshelves, the missing photographs from the hallway walls. It was that the house felt less lived in somehow, like Catherine had taken some essential element with her when she packed. She was in the kitchen when he walked in, standing at the stove stirring something that smelled like tomato sauce. For a moment it felt almost normal, like any other Friday evening when he came home from work to find dinner being prepared. But then he noticed the boxes stacked by the back door, 3 of them labeled in Catherine's neat handwriting, and reality crashed back over him. "I made spaghetti," Catherine said without turning around. "I figured we should have dinner together. One last time in this kitchen." The phrase "one last time" hit William harder than he expected. It made everything feel final in a way that their conversation the night before hadn't quite managed. This wasn't just Catherine leaving for a few days to clear her head. This was the end of their daily life together. The end of shared meals and morning coffee and falling asleep to the sound of each other's breathing. "Thank you," he said, though his appetite was the last thing on his mind. "Do you need help with anything?" "The boxes," or Catherine shook her head. "I'm almost done. I'll load them in the car after dinner." They ate in relative silence, both of them picking at their food while the weight of everything unsaid hung between them. William found himself watching Catherine eat, noticing the way she twirled her spaghetti, the small satisfied sound she made when she tasted the sauce. These tiny details that he'd stopped paying attention to years ago suddenly seemed precious, worth memorizing. After dinner, Catherine began loading her boxes into her car, while William stood in the driveway feeling useless. She'd packed efficiently, taking only what she truly needed, leaving behind the furniture and household items they'd accumulated together. Watching her fit her life into the trunk of her Honda Civic made William realize how little space a person actually needed, how much of what they'd called necessary was really just accumulation. The first week without Catherine passed in a strange blur of routines that no longer made sense. William found himself making coffee for 2 people every morning, setting out 2 plates for breakfast before remembering he was alone. The house echoed differently now. Every footstep and door closing amplified in the emptiness Catherine had left behind. Even Maisie, their tabby cat, seemed confused by the change, spending hours sitting by the front door as if waiting for Catherine to return. William threw himself into work with an intensity that worried his crew. He arrived at job sites before anyone else and stayed until well after dark, finding excuses to review plans that didn't need reviewing, to double-check measurements that were already perfect. Physical labor had always been his way of working through problems, but this problem couldn't be solved with tools and materials. This problem required skills he wasn't sure he possessed. On Tuesday evening, he found himself standing in the produce section of the grocery store, staring at a display of tomatoes and realizing he had no idea what to buy. For 8 years, Catherine had done most of the grocery shopping, planning meals, keeping track of what they needed. William knew how to grill a steak and make sandwiches, but the idea of planning a week's worth of meals felt overwhelming. He ended up buying frozen dinners and canned soup, the kind of food he'd eaten as a bachelor that now tasted like cardboard and regret. Wednesday brought rain that matched his mood, a steady drizzle that made the construction site muddy and treacherous. William found himself thinking about Catherine at the library, wondering if she was happy in her sister's guest room, whether she missed their house, their life together, him. He'd picked up his phone a dozen times to call her, but stopped himself each time. She'd asked for space, and the least he could do was respect that, even if it felt like holding his breath underwater. Thursday arrived with the weight of the counseling appointment hanging over everything. William had never been to therapy before, had never been the kind of person who talked about feelings with strangers. He'd always believed that problems should be worked out privately, between the people involved, but clearly his approach hadn't been working. Maybe it was time to try something different. Dr. Martinez's office was in a converted Victorian house downtown, with soft lighting and comfortable chairs that were supposed to put people at ease. William sat in the waiting room, his hands sweating despite the air conditioning. checking his phone every few minutes even though he had nowhere else to be. When Catherine walked in at exactly 4:20, his heart jumped in a way that surprised him. She looked different somehow, more relaxed than she'd been in months, wearing a blue dress he'd always liked and her hair pulled back in a way that made her eyes look larger. "Hi," she said softly, taking the chair across from him. "How are you?" "I'm okay," William lied, "because I haven't slept properly in 4 days and I've been eating cereal for dinner." Didn't seem like the right answer. "How are you? How's your sister's place?" "Good," Catherine said. And for the first time in months, when she said something was good, William believed she actually meant it. "Jennifer's been great. We've been talking a lot. It's nice to have someone to talk to." The implication stung, that Catherine had needed someone to talk to and he hadn't been available for that role. But William pushed down his defensive reaction and tried to just listen, the way he probably should have been doing for months. Dr. Martinez called them in a few minutes later. A woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair who immediately put them both at ease. Her office was warm and inviting, with plants on every surface and soft music playing quietly in the background. "I understand you're here because you're going through a difficult time in your relationship," Dr. Martinez said after they'd settled into chairs facing each other. "Catherine, you mentioned on the phone that you've recently separated. Can you tell me a little about what brought you to that decision?" Catherine glanced at William before answering, and he nodded to let her know it was okay to speak freely. Over the next 20 minutes, she talked about feeling invisible in their marriage, about how they'd stopped communicating about anything meaningful, about losing herself in trying to be the wife she thought William wanted instead of being the person she actually was. William listened to her describe their marriage from her perspective, and it was like hearing about a completely different relationship. Where he'd seen contentment, she'd felt resignation. Where he'd seen stability, she'd felt stagnation. Where he'd seen love, she'd felt obligation. When it was his turn to talk, William found the words coming easier than he'd expected. He talked about how he'd gotten so focused on providing for their future that he'd forgotten to live in their present. He admitted that he'd made assumptions about what Catherine wanted instead of asking her. He acknowledged that he'd been a better business partner than husband, treating their marriage like a project that would run itself once the foundation was in place. "It sounds like you both love each other very much," Dr. Martinez observed after they'd both shared their perspectives. "But you've been loving different versions of each other, the people you used to be or the people you thought the other person wanted you to be. Is that accurate?" Both William and Catherine nodded, and William felt a strange relief at having someone else put words to what they'd been struggling to articulate. "The good news," Dr. Martinez continued, "is that you're both here. You're both willing to be honest about the problems, and you both seem committed to figuring out whether this relationship can work. The challenging news is that the work ahead of you isn't about fixing what's broken. It's about deciding whether the people you are now can build something new together." She gave them homework for the week, individual exercises about identifying their own needs and wants, separate from what they thought their partner expected. She also asked them to write letters to each other, not to be shared yet, but to help them organize their thoughts about what they'd learned about themselves during their time apart. Walking out of the office together felt strange after a week of no contact. They stood on the sidewalk outside Dr. Martinez's building, neither quite ready to say goodbye but not sure what came next. "Do you want to get coffee?" Catherine asked, surprising William. "I know a place nearby. We could talk about how that went." The coffee shop was small and crowded, the kind of place Catherine had always loved and William had always found too noisy. But today, the bustle of other conversations felt like a protective barrier, making it easier to talk without the weight of their empty house pressing down on them. "That was harder than I expected," Catherine said, wrapping her hands around her mug for warmth. "But also, helpful maybe, having someone else help us see the patterns we've fallen into." William nodded, stirring sugar into his coffee even though he didn't usually take sugar. "I keep thinking about what she said, about loving the people we used to be instead of who we are now. I don't even know who I am now, outside of work, outside of being your husband." "I've been thinking about that too," Catherine said. "At Jennifer's, I've been reading again. Really reading, not just skimming before bed. I forgot how much I love getting lost in a good book. And I've been cooking, trying new recipes instead of just making the same 5 meals over and over. Small things, but they feel like finding pieces of myself I'd lost. They talked for an hour, really talked in a way they hadn't in months. Not about schedules or responsibilities or what needed to be fixed around the house, but about ideas and feelings and dreams they'd forgotten they had. William told Catherine about a book on sustainable building practices he'd been reading, how it had made him think about maybe shifting his business in a new direction. Catherine told him about a writing workshop she'd seen advertised at the community center, something she'd never had the courage to try but was considering now. When they finally said goodbye outside the coffee shop, William felt something he hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not hope that everything would go back to the way it was, but hope that maybe, with work and honesty and time, they could build something new together, something better than what they'd had before. "Same time next week?" Catherine asked, and William nodded. "Same time next week," he agreed. As he watched her walk to her car, William realized that for the first time since this all began, he wasn't afraid of the future. He didn't know what would happen between them, whether they'd find their way back to each other or learn to love each other as friends instead of spouses. But he knew that whatever happened, they were finally being honest with each other and with themselves, and that felt like a beginning, even if it had started with an ending. 3 months later, William sat in the same coffee shop where he and Catherine had talked after their first counseling session, but this time he was alone. He'd started coming here on Thursday afternoons after their weekly appointments with Dr. Martinez, using the time to process what they'd discussed, to write in the journal she'd suggested he keep. The teenage barista with purple hair knew his order now: black coffee with 1 sugar, something he'd discovered about himself during these months of learning who he was when he wasn't trying to be who he thought he should be. The work with Dr. Martinez had been harder than anything William had ever done. Harder than learning to run his own business. Harder than building their house from the ground up. Harder than any physical challenge he'd ever faced. It required a different kind of strength, the kind that came from being vulnerable instead of invulnerable, from admitting weakness instead of projecting competence. He'd learned things about himself that surprised him, like how much of his identity had been built around being needed, around being the provider and protector, and how threatened he'd felt when Catherine started pulling away because it meant he was failing at the role he'd assigned himself. He'd learned that his silence, which he'd always thought of as being low maintenance and easy to live with, had actually been a form of emotional unavailability that made Catherine feel like she was living with a roommate instead of a partner. Catherine had been doing her own work too, and William could see the changes in her every week. She'd started the writing workshop she'd mentioned, and had even submitted a short story to a local literary magazine. She'd cut her hair shorter, joined a hiking group, bought a small apartment downtown that she was decorating with colors she'd never felt brave enough to use before. She was becoming more herself, more vibrant, more present in a way that was beautiful to watch, even though it sometimes hurt to realize how much of herself she'd been hiding during their marriage. Their counseling sessions had evolved over the months from painful excavations of what had gone wrong to tentative explorations of what might be possible. They'd learned to communicate in ways they never had before, to ask for what they needed instead of hoping the other person would guess, to express disappointment and frustration without attacking each other's character. 2 weeks ago, Dr. Martinez had asked them a question that had been hanging in the air ever since. If you met each other today, as the people you are now, would you choose to build a relationship together? It was a question that couldn't be answered quickly or easily. It required them to separate who they were now from their history together, from their shared memories and accumulated resentments, from their fear of starting over and their comfort with the familiar. William pulled out his phone and looked at the text Catherine had sent him that morning. "Can we meet after our session today? I've been thinking about Dr. Martinez's question, and I have some things I want to say." His stomach tightened with anxiety, the same feeling he'd had before difficult conversations throughout this process. But underneath the anxiety was something else: curiosity about what Catherine wanted to share, respect for the thoughtful way she approached these discussions, appreciation for how much courage it took for both of them to keep showing up to do this work. At 4:30, William walked into Dr. Martinez's office to find Catherine already there, looking nervous but determined. She was wearing the same blue dress she'd worn to their first session, but she carried herself differently now, with a confidence that hadn't been there 3 months ago. Before we start, Catherine said as soon as Dr. Martinez closed the door, I want to say something to William. Dr. Martinez nodded and settled into her chair, giving Catherine the space to speak. Catherine turned to face William directly, her green eyes clear and steady. I've been thinking about your question, Dr. Martinez, about whether we'd choose each other if we met today. And I've realized that the question isn't really about choice. It's about capacity. William felt his heart start to beat faster, unsure where this was leading. 3 months ago, I didn't have the capacity to be in a healthy relationship with anyone. Catherine continued. I'd lost myself so completely that I had nothing authentic to offer. I was trying to be what I thought you wanted instead of figuring out what I actually wanted. That's not your fault. That's work I had to do for myself. She paused, taking a breath before continuing. And you didn't have the capacity either. You were so focused on achieving and providing that you'd forgotten how to just be present with another person. You were trying to love me the way you thought love should look instead of paying attention to what I actually needed. William nodded, recognizing the truth in what she was saying. Those patterns seemed so obvious now, but they'd been invisible when he was living inside them. But now, Catherine said, and her voice grew stronger, I think we both have that capacity, not to go back to who we were, but to move forward as who we're becoming. William felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of fear he'd been carrying for months. I don't want to go back to our old marriage, Catherine said. That marriage was built on assumptions and expectations and a lot of silence about important things. But I would like to try building something new with you. Something based on who we actually are, not who we think we're supposed to be. William looked at Catherine, really looked at her, and saw someone he'd been married to for 8 years but was only now beginning to truly know. Someone who was brave enough to leave when staying was killing her spirit, and brave enough to suggest starting over when it would be easier to just move on. I would like that too, he said quietly, but I need you to know that I can't promise I'll be perfect at it. I'm still learning how to be present, how to pay attention to what matters instead of just what's urgent. I'm still figuring out who I am when I'm not just trying to accomplish things. I don't need you to be perfect, Catherine replied. I need you to be honest. I need you to tell me when you're struggling instead of just working longer hours. I need you to ask me what I'm thinking instead of assuming you know. I need you to be curious about who I'm becoming instead of just comfortable with who I've always been. Dr. Martinez had been listening quietly, and now she leaned forward slightly. What would this new relationship look like practically? Where would you live? How would you handle the patterns that caused problems before? William and Catherine looked at each other, and William realized they'd both been thinking about these same questions. I'd like to keep my apartment for a while, Catherine said. Not because I don't want to live with you eventually, but because I need to know I can take care of myself, that I'm choosing to be with you instead of depending on you. And I think you need to know that too. William felt a flicker of the old fear, the need to have everything settled and secure, but he pushed it down. Catherine wasn't rejecting him by wanting to maintain her independence. She was offering him the gift of her choice rather than her resignation. I think that makes sense, he said, and I'd like us to keep coming to counseling, even when things are going well. I don't want us to fall back into old patterns just because they're comfortable. They spent the rest of the session talking about practical details, how often they'd see each other, how they'd handle finances, what they'd tell their families and friends. But underneath the logistics was a current of excitement that William hadn't felt in years. The excitement of building something new instead of just maintaining something old. After the session, they walked to Catherine's car together, and she turned to face him before getting in. William, she said, I want you to know that this isn't about giving our marriage another chance. Our marriage is over. What we're talking about is starting a completely new relationship, with the same person but as different people. William nodded, understanding the distinction. A relationship where we choose each other every day instead of just assuming we're stuck with each other. Exactly, Catherine smiled, and it was the first completely unguarded smile he'd seen from her in over a year. A relationship where we love who we actually are, not who we used to be or who we think we should be. As William watched Catherine drive away, he realized that for the first time in his adult life, he was excited about uncertainty. He didn't know how this new relationship would unfold, what challenges they'd face, whether they'd make it work this time. But he knew they were both bringing their whole selves to it now. and that felt like the strongest foundation he'd ever built. The silence that had broken him had also saved him, forcing him to hear what Catherine had been trying to tell him for months. Sometimes the most loving thing you could do for someone was to let them go completely, so they could choose to come back as themselves instead of as who they thought you wanted them to be. Walking back to his truck, William felt lighter than he had in years. He was no longer the man who thought love meant holding on so tightly that you forgot to pay attention to what you were holding. He was becoming someone who understood that real love meant creating space for both people to grow, even if that growth led them in directions you couldn't predict or control.